8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Project Egg Show. I'm your host, Ben Gothard, and today we have the honor of speaking with Steve Snyder. How you doing today, Steve?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks a lot. Glad to be
Awesome.
here.
Yeah, me too. Me too. So I want to jump right in, and I want to know, what is your story?
Boy, that's a big question, and there's a lot of ways to go on that. Um, uh, you want me to start with my background or
From the very beginning.
from the very beginning? Okay. Well, I was born in Pasadena, California, home of the Rose Bowl, 1947. So it was a couple of years after World War II ended. Actually went to school in nearby the town of San Marino, California. Uh, Went to college at UCLA. Um, my mother graduated from UCLA. When she was there, she was a classmate of the legendary Jackie Robinson. And when I was there, I was a classmate of Lou Alcindor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So that was kind of fun. And I graduated from UCLA in 1970. Vietnam War was going on at that time. So I went in the California Army National Guard for 6 years, from 70 to 76. Fortunately for me, my unit wasn't called up, though, to go overseas. And then I got into to sales. I had a 40-year career in sales and sales management. The last 36 years was with a company called Vision Service Plan, VSP, which is the nation's largest provider of vision care. It's a benefit that corporations offer their employees to cover eye exams, glasses, and contact lenses. And travel quite a bit all over the United States when I was working for them the last 25 years, pretty extensively, calling on Fortune 500 companies trying to sell our program to them. And then I retired in 2009. Yeah, in August of 2009. So it's almost 10 years since I've been retired now. And I was kind of a happy retiree, relaxing, but that being retired, I had the time to really delve into my dad's war history in more detail. My parents had kept a lot of material from the war years, and I just wanted to go through that information and kind of organize it to learn a few more details. At that time, I had no intention of writing a book. But there were two items that were really significant in that material that my parents had kept. One was a diary that my dad wrote while he was missing in action after being shot. His B-17 bomber was shot down over Belgium. And that diary is absolutely riveting. It's in the book. And the other item that was really significant were all the letters that my dad wrote to my mother while he was stationed in England. And reading those was just fascinating. He was very candid in what he wrote in the letters. He wrote about what bombing missions were like, what life was like on the air base in England, what life was like in London and England at the time, escapades of him and his crew. And I just became fascinated with the story. And it became my passion. And I started doing all this research. And then finally, 3 years into my research, I just came to the conclusion that the story of my dad and his crew was so compelling and so unique that it needed to be told. People needed to read about it. So I decided to write a book. And now I'm basically working full time again. Really doing pretty much the same thing I did at Vision Service Plan. I'm traveling all over the place, and instead of selling vision care, I'm promoting a book. I go to air shows all around the United States. I do a lot of speaking, make PowerPoint presentations. It's basically changed my life. I live in Seal Beach, California, which is in Orange County, about 40 miles south of LA, but also have a second home in Sedona, Arizona. So we kind of go back and forth, but I'm hardly at either one. I travel so much. So that's kind of my story. Yeah, like I say, it's taken me on a journey, and I love doing what I do. I'm also on the board of directors, and immediate past president, actually, of the 306 Bomb Group Historical Association. My dad was in the 306 Bomb Group. And it's our mission to remember, honor, and educate, to remember the air war over Europe, to honor the men who fought it, and to educate the public about it, especially younger generations. And that's really why I do what I do, is to keep the memory alive. You know, World War II was over 70 years ago, and it's fading in people's memories. And it's my quest not to let that happen.
Wow. And I totally agree with that quest. And I think it is such an important thing, is to make sure that we don't forget what happened, that we don't lose touch with the history and the facts of what really happened back then.
Yeah, they were amazing men. There was no other event in history that affected more people than World War II. 60 million people died, millions more were wounded, millions more were displaced and left homeless. It changed the course of the United States and the world forever. And the brave young men who fought and died for freedom, in my opinion, are without doubt the greatest generation. And as we're saying, their sacrifice must never be forgotten. My tagline actually is, "It is our duty to remember," and I live that every day.
So let's talk a little bit more about your father's history. What were some of the the key points, the biggest lessons to be learned, the biggest pieces of history that happened during his lifetime and his career?
Well, he was born in Norfolk, Nebraska in 1915. And then he moved to California when he was 13 with his family. And then, went through high school here. He was captain of the basketball team. And then he didn't go to college. He started working for Desmond's Clothing Company in Los Angeles. And then because of the first peacetime draft in the U.S. history, implemented in the fall of 1940 by President Franklin Roosevelt, he registered for the draft, and then went into the Army in the spring of 1941. And he was stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington, and initially didn't go in the Air Force. He went into the Army in the infantry. And then a few months later, he married my mother, Ruth Hempel. She was born and raised in Pasadena as well. Shortly after she graduated from UCLA. And then a few months later, and on December 7th of 1941, Pearl Harbor was bombed by Japan. The United States was at war. So at that time, my mother was very fearful. The future was very uncertain. So she went up to visit my dad in Washington over Christmas. And 9 months later, my oldest sister, Susan Ruth Snyder, was born. And at the time, my dad was kind of worried how he's going to support his new family. Here he has a baby on the way, and he didn't think he could do that very well on a private's pay in the Army. So that's when he decided to volunteer for the Air Force. So he really did it because he disliked the Army so much. It's that he wanted to better provide for his family because they paid better in the Air Force. And especially if he could make it through pilot school and become an officer, then he'd make even more money. So after a year in the infantry, he volunteered and went through pre-flight training at Santa Ana Army Air Base in Southern California, and then went through the various stages of pilot training. And in April of 1941, he graduated from advanced pilot training in Douglas, Arizona, where he received his commission as a second lieutenant and his pilot's wings. There he went through transitional training where he learned how to fly a 4-engine B-17 bomber, and then went to operational crew training where the various members of the team came together. They learned to operate, or members of the crew came together. They learned to operate as a team. And then once deemed ready, they were assigned overseas to the European Theater of Operations. And on October 21st, he and his crew reported to the 306 bomb group at Thurley, England, which I'll be at this coming month in August. I'll be visiting again. It's located about 90 miles north of London. And there he started flying combat missions over occupied Europe and Germany. The 306 bomb group was part of the 8th Air Force that was stationed in England during World War II. And their mission was to hit industrial and military targets to cripple Nazi Germany's ability to wage war. They were nicknamed the Mighty Eighth by Gerald Astor, a noted historian, because of the number of planes they put up in the sky on these bombing missions, which numbered into the hundreds. And on December 24th of 1944, 2,000 bombers hit Berlin. I can't even imagine 2,000 bombers in the sky. When the first planes are dropping their bombs, they're planes that haven't even taken off yet from England. That bomber stream was so long. And it was really tough flying combat missions in the 8th Air Force. It was really brutal and extremely dangerous. There were 23,000 men that died in the 8th Air Force, which was more than the entire Marine Corps fighting in the Pacific. And there was another 28,000 men who became prisoners of war after their bombers were knocked out of the sky, either by German fighters or anti-aircraft fire. Being a combat crewman in the 8th Air Force was the most dangerous duty assignment in the United States military during World War II. And it was dangerous from the time they took off to the time they landed. I can go on forever here. I want to give you a chance to answer, ask questions rather than me just going on and talking. But I can just go on about this because maybe you can tell it is my passion.
Well, you definitely might be a little passionate about it, but this is riveting, and I think the more we explore it, the better. So I would love to continue on with the narrative and keep hearing the story.
Okay. As I mentioned, it was dangerous from the time they took off to the time they landed. At the peak, there were 40 bomb groups in the 8th Air Force located in an area in and around East Anglia, England, which is about the size of Vermont. And these air bases were just located only about 5-10 miles apart. So on the day of a mission, you had all these bombers taking off from these air bases all at the same time. And back then, there was no air traffic control. There was no radar. Everything was based on visual sight. And usually the weather in England was either overcast with clouds or socked in with fog, and they couldn't see anything up until they got above the cloud layer. So mid-air collisions were not uncommon. Then they had to form up. And for all these bombers to form up, and it took about an hour to 2 hours before they could even head across the English Channel to begin their mission. And then they had to deal with the elements. These planes weren't pressurized, so above 10,000 feet, they had to go on oxygen, or else they'd pass out and die. And also at the altitude that they were flying, it was minus 40 to 60 degrees below zero. So it was freezing up there, and frostbite was a huge problem. Many airmen were hospitalized for lengthy periods of time with serious frostbite injuries. And one of my dad's waist gunners was in the hospital for 2.5 months because of the seriousness of the injuries he suffered. And then they had to deal with enemy fighters. The Germans had radar stations set up along the coast of Germany, so they knew when these bomber formations were coming, and they'd send up their Air Force to intercept them. Their German Air Force was called the Luftwaffe. And they'd have to deal with enemy fighters. And then when they neared the target, when they started their bomb run, the next thing they had dealt with was anti-aircraft fire, or flak. Flak was the abbreviation for the German word for aircraft defense cannon. And those weapons were deadly. They fired about 20 shells a minute, and they were calibrated to explode at the same altitude that the bombers were flying. And these shells were filled with all different shapes and sizes of a razor sharp metal called shrapnel. that when the shells exploded would burst out hundreds of feet and easily penetrate the thin aluminum skin of those bombers, let alone, the flesh and bone of the crew. And once they got right in among those shells exploding, the explosions were, ear shattering. The concussions from these shells exploding would just violently rock the ship. My dad told me that even though it was so freezing at that altitude and during these bomb runs, he'd be sweating profusely and be dripping wet with the adrenaline running through his body. And then once the bombers dropped their bombs, the planes that made it through the bomb run, they would make a big turn and head to a designated point called a rally point, where the bombers that made it through would try to form up again, then head back to their bases in England, where once again they'd be faced with that German fighters attacking them. So it was brutal. And every time these guys went up on these missions, they never knew if it was going to be their last one. In the early part of the war, it was the 8th Air Force took devastating losses, particularly in 1943 was the worst year. At the beginning of the war, there was no mission limit for these combat crews. They just kept flying. And the morale started going into the tank because they knew they'd never make it back home. They'd either be killed or they'd be shot down and become prisoners of war. And finally, the 8th Air Force realized that predicament, and in the spring of 1943, they implemented a mission limit of 25. If somebody completed 25 combat missions, they were able to go back to the States. But even though they did that, it was statistically impossible to complete 25 missions. The average number of missions flown in 1943 before being shot down was only 6. But yet these guys would keep going back up, on these missions, seeing their buddies being killed or what have you. So it was, those guys were something else. And I was on a mission to Frankfurt, Germany on February 8th of 1944. My dad's plane was named the Susan Ruth after my oldest sister, because he was the first pilot of the plane, and as such, he was the commander of the crew and the plane. B-17 had a 10-man crew. There were 4 officers, the first pilot, which my dad was, and a co-pilot, and a navigator, a bombardier, and then there were 6 enlisted men who were mainly gunners. So his plane was named the Susan Ruth. It dropped its bombs successfully, but their bomb bay doors got hit by flak, and they couldn't get them back up. And as a result, that caused a drag on the plane. They started losing airspeed, and they started to lag behind the formation. And that's the worst thing that could happen to a bomber, because they flew in formations called a combat box formation and tight formations. And when you were in these tight formations, you had protection from the group. It was kind of like a herd of animals. If one starts lagging behind, the wolves or lions will just, come in for the kill. And that was kind of the way it is for the bomber formations. Because those bombers, those B-17s, they were very heavily armed. They had 13 50 caliber machine guns on each plane, so they could put out a tremendous amount of firepower. And so the theory was flying in these tight formations, all this interlocking or overlapping firepower could defend themselves from the Luftwaffe. So if you got out of that formation, you were pretty much a dead duck, and that's what happened to the Susan Ruth. They were singled out by 2 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, and who came in for the kill and shot my dad's plane down. 2 of the crew of the 10-man crew were killed in the plane, and then the other 8 were able to bail out successfully. But both those German pilots or planes were both shot down. One was piloted by Siegfried Merrick, and his plane crashed and he was killed in the plane. And the other was piloted by Hans Berger, who was able to bail out, and he made it through the war. Kind of a funny story. When I was doing my research, during these 3 years, one day my wife Glenda asked me just real nonchalantly, well, why don't you try to find the German pilot that shot down your dad's plane? And I thought to myself, well, she doesn't know what she's talking about. She's ignorant. There's a crazy idea. There's no way in the world I could do that. It'd be impossible. But like a good husband, I did what she told me to do. And I found Hans Berger. And fortunately for me, became a translator after the war. So he speaks English. And he gave me some wonderful insight that's in the book about what it's like to go up against the 8th Air Force. And Hans Berger is still alive today. He's 95 years old, lives in Munich, Germany. And I'm going to go visit him in September. Again, it'll probably be the last time I ever get to see him. So as I mentioned, in August, I'm going over to England to visit the 306 Bomb Group Museum. Their air base is no longer there, but there's a nice little museum. And then I'm going to visit other 8th Air Force Bomb Group memorials and museums in the area. And then from there, I'm going over to Belgium for the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Belgium, which is September 2nd. And then they'll also have ceremonies to memorials they've erected to my dad's crew and attend those. And then I'm going to go down to Normandy to the D-Day beaches. And then after that, go to Munich to visit Hans. So that's going to be a big trip coming up in about 3 weeks or so. Well, again, that'll keep me busy. After my dad's plane was attacked, I mentioned that the other 8 crewmen bailed out. And when my dad bailed, he was the last one to bail out of the plane, and the plane was on fire, and he didn't know what happened to any of the guys who were in the back of the plane. Mainly those enlisted men, the gunners, because the 4 officers were in the front of the plane, and the nose of the plane was the bombardier and the navigator, and then up above them in the cockpit were the 2 pilots. So he knew that they bailed out successfully, but since he was the last one to bail out, he and the plane actually came down in Belgium, and the other guys that were able to bail out came down in France. It was right on the French-Belgian border. And when my dad came down just in Belgium, north of the border, he came down in some trees, and his parachute got hung up in the branches, and he couldn't get down. He was dangling 20 feet off the ground. But fortunately for him, a couple of young Belgian men came to his rescue. Their names are Raymond Dervan and Henri Franken. They saw his predicament. They went back to the Dervan farmhouse, got a ladder and rope, and helped my dad down the tree. It was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. They just told him to stay put and hide because they thought it'd be too dangerous to try to move him in daylight with German patrols combing the areas looking for these guys. So he did that. That night, they came back and got him, and they took him to the Dervan farmhouse. My dad had some minor burn wounds from the flames in the cockpit and some minor shrapnel wounds in one leg. So they bandaged him up there. And he just stayed there one night because they thought it was too dangerous for him to stay there any longer than that with those German patrols, still in the area. So the next night, a Belgium's customs officer named Paul Tilcan came on a tandem bicycle to pick him up and take him to another location, a safer location. And so it was middle of the night, pitch black. It was raining. They hop on the bike. My dad could only pedal with his good leg. And they came to a hill and they couldn't pedal up the hill anymore. So they started pushing the bike up the hill. When they got to the top of the hill, there's a little cabaret there, and the lights were on, music was playing. People were talking loudly, laughing, and all of a sudden, 2 German officers come out the front door with their arms around these young girls. One of them comes up to my dad and asks him for a light for a cigarette. Well, my dad can't speak French or English, German or French at that point, but fortunately Paul could, and he lit the guy's cigarette. And they went on their way. My dad said that these German officers were too snockered. That's the term he liked to use. And too interested in these young girls to pay too much attention to a couple of yokels, pushing this bike up in the middle of the night. And from there, my dad was moved from place to place to place. how long he stayed in a given house depended on how brave the Belgian people were who lived there and how brave the Belgian underground thought it was for him to stay there. He might stay one night, he might spend 6 weeks. And the people who hid my dad and other members of the Downed Airmen, for that matter, were unbelievably brave people. They risked not only their lives, but those of their friends and their family. Because if the German secret police, the Gestapo, found out about it, they'd be arrested, tortured, and either shot or sent to concentration camps. And some of the people who helped my dad and other members of his crew met that fate. My dad owed his life to those people. He said that they would let him sleep in their bed. They'd sleep on the floor. They'd give him the larger portion of food. Unbelievable. And there's instances described in the book where my dad was almost discovered by the Gestapo. On this one occasion, he was staying at the home of Maurice and Ghislaine Bayou. It was with them that he wrote his diary while he was missing in action. And the Gestapo pounded on the door, and Maurice told my dad to go up on the climb out of the attic and go up on the roof. And then when it was safe, he'd come back and got him. Well, he never came back the entire night. My dad spent the entire night on that roof. And in my travels to Belgium, I've been in these homes, both at Der Van farmhouse and the Bayou house, which is in Charleroi, Belgium. And yeah, that roof he climbed on was really steep. It's a tile roof, and you crawl out of this little tiny window in the attic to get up on it, in the middle of the night. That had to be pretty scary just in itself. I can't imagine spending the whole night up there on that roof. It was really uncomfortable. But Maurice thought it was too dangerous for him to come back down into the house in case the Gestapo came back. And that was really stressful for my father. Here he is, his plane was attacked, it's on fire, he has to bail out. He comes down in a foreign country, has no idea where he is, doesn't know what happened to his buddies on the crew, can't communicate with the U.S. military. He's being helped by total strangers who he initially can't communicate with because he can't speak French. He has a little French English dictionary in his evasion kit that he can kind of refer to. And any one of these people could be a collaborator and turn him over to the Gestapo. So finally, my dad got tired of hiding. Word came that the Allies had landed at Normandy on June 6th of 44. And he wanted to get back in the fights. Unlike most airmen, he had that year's infantry training at Fort Lewis, so he knew how to fight on the ground. So he decided he wanted to join the French resistance, and his helpers tried to talk him out of this because it was way too dangerous, because he could get killed fighting, or if he got captured by the Gestapo, they would have shot him out right on the spot for being a spy or a terrorist. They tried to convince him to just, stay hidden there in Belgium and just wait until the U.S. troops came up through France after D-Day and to get liberated. But he said he was going with or without their help. And so he kind of forced, I guess, one of his helpers, Amy Cools is her name. They got on bicycles and she just escorted him across the border into France, and he hooked up with this French resistance unit. The French resistance was called the Maquis. And they were made up of small, independent, ragtag guerrilla groups all across France. They harassed the Germans. They would disrupt communications, sabotage railroad lines, attack convoys, assassinate German officers. And they got their instructions through coded messages from the British through coded messages over the BBC. And my dad said the information they gave was unbelievably accurate. If they said a German patrol was going to be coming down this road on this day at this time, sure enough, they would be. And that was as a result of the British breaking the German Enigma code and knowing everything that the Germans were up to. And then they were also supplied by the British through airdrops. And there's a number of encounters described in the book from my dad and the Maquis group had with Germans are pretty exciting. And I went to a farmhouse there just in northern France, which I'll visit again. And when I go back in August, in September, where the French resistant unit stayed for a while. Yeah. He stayed in this upper room way on top of the farmhouse, but he had a pretty good view of the road down below. And on one occasion, it was early in the morning, and he was shaving, had shaving cream on his face, dressed in his skivvies, and this German patrol comes up the road, so he had to jump out the second story. There weren't really windows. It's big openings in the back of the farmhouse where the granary was, where they threw out the grain to feed the animals, and had to hightail it into the woods so he wouldn't get captured. And I've been up in that little room where he was hidden. So very exciting to be these places where history was made with my dad. And then 7 months after he bailed out, word filtered to the group that there were U.S. troops in a nearby village of Trélon, France. So he walked over into town, into the town square. Actually, was elements of Patton's Third Army, which had come up through France after D-Day. Went up to an army major, identified himself. He was interrogated to make sure he was who he said he was. When they were satisfied, he got on a troop caravan. Actually, they were taking German prisoners to Paris. So he got to Paris and then got on a transport and got back to England, where he sent a Western Union telegram to my mother saying that he was fit as a fiddle and to bank the money. He had all that back pay from 7 months while he was missing in action. So that was a happy day a glorious day for my mother. Actually, my other sister was born when my dad was missing in action. So my mother was back here in California with a 1-year-old baby girl, Susan, infant girl, Nancy, not knowing if she'd ever see her husband again until she got that telegram when he got back to England. So that was a happy day for my folks. And then the Air Force had a rule that if you were shot down over occupied territory and aided by the underground, that you couldn't fly again, because they were worried if you went back into combat, shot down a second time, and were captured by the Germans and tortured, that you give up the identity of the people that helped you the first time. So my dad was sent back to the States, where he became a B-17 flight instructor for the remainder of the war. When the war ended in May 8th, or at least in Europe on May 8th of 45. And then in September 45 in the Pacific against Japan. So that's kind of the story of my dad. I don't know how many guys would have decided to join the French resistance and fight against the Germans. That took an unbelievably amount of bravery and courage to do that, and not just stay hunkered down and hidden, because that was an exceedingly dangerous thing for him to do. And unfortunately, I never really asked him specifically why he did that. But I think he just thought it was his duty. Other Americans were fighting and dying. And he felt that, he should join them. And that's the way those guys were. If you talk to World War II veterans today, they just act like it was no big deal. They said, well, the country was at war. We had a job to do. So we went over there and did it. And then we came back home and got on with our lives. It was amazing people. Back then, the United States was a lot different place. It was very rural back then. Most of the people lived out in the country, unlike today, where most people, live in cities or, even along the coasts. It was a rural, a nation, lots of farmers. And these guys who went to war were just young kids. Really, they were in their late teens, early 20s, just out of high school. A lot of these guys had never been out of their county. Let alone finding themselves halfway around the world, fighting a war. They'd never been away from home or their mothers or their families, or the scrutiny of that. And here they're totally independent all of a sudden. booze, cigarettes, sex, anything goes. There's no one to stop them from doing any of that. So it was also a very exciting time for these guys. London was, there was no city in the world like London at that time. That was the biggest, most metropolitan city in the world. And to be there uh, was pretty exciting for those guys. You know, and even my dad admitted that, even though you're facing, death all the time. So it's, you get close when you're, fighting combat with these crews or your platoon or whatever it happened to be. So just an amazing story. There's over a couple things about the book. There's over 200 time period photographs in the book. What makes it unique because you can visualize everything you're reading about. Lots of the pictures sent to my dad by his helpers after the war, or many pictures provided me by two Belgian gentlemen. I probably wouldn't have written the book if it wasn't for these two Belgian gentlemen who were young boys during the war, who were greatly affected by it. They saw firsthand the atrocities committed by the Nazis against their family and friends. And later on in life, they became local historians. Their names were Dr. Paul Delahaye and Jacques Lelot. And they interviewed these Belgian people who were members of the Belgian underground about events that took place involving my dad and his crew. And they documented their testimony. And they gave me unbelievably detailed information and pictures about events that would have been lost forever without their dedicated research. So I owe them a huge debt. Dr. Paul Delahaye is no longer with us. He died in 2013 at the age of 82. And in 1984, he was the founder of what was then called the Belgium American Foundation. As you can see, I'm talking away here. I'm not even giving you a chance to say anything. But he formed this association to remember and honor the American troops that liberated their country from Nazi oppression and Nazi occupation. And they erected a number of memorials in the area to do that. And they have ceremonies at these memorials on the anniversary dates of those events. And in 1989, they erected a memorial to my dad and his crew, to the crew of the Susan Ruth. And my dad went over for the dedication of the memorial with the three other crew members that were still living at the time. Of the 10-man crew, 5 of them made it back home from the war, but 5 of them were killed over there. 2 of them are still buried in Europe. And they went over with their spouses. And like most World War II veterans, my dad didn't talk much about the war when I was young. But when he went back for the dedication, there he was reunited with all these Belgian people that hit him during the war, saw those, revisited those homes where he was hidden in. That brought it all back. And he started talking about it after that. And then my first trip to Belgium was in 1994 with my parents. And that's when it became personal for me because I saw all those places firsthand, especially going with my father. He was kind of the master of the main speaker, keynote speaker. And the Belgian people are wonderful people. To this day, they're still so thankful and so grateful for the Americans coming to their rescue. And they do a great job of educating the younger generations too, to honor and remember. When I went over with my parents in '94, they couldn't have treated him any better than if he was the president of the United States. There was one time we were late. They put up all these big tents that seat hundreds of people where they have band concerts and lunches and dinners and dancing. And my dad, we were late to one of the performances this one time. And when we walked in this tent, all the hundreds of people stood up and started applauding my dad. It was just, I get chills just talking about it. Just treating him like a king. And then when I go back, I went by the second trip with me. My parents weren't well enough to travel at that time in 2004 for the 60th anniversary. They treated me like I was one of the U.S. airmen, and it was embarrassing that, they were treating me so well that, I'm just the son of the pilot. I didn't do anything. But that's the way they feel. And so I made some lifelong friends over there. I'm really looking forward to seeing them. Jacques Lowe Jacques is, I think, 82 or 83 now, but he's going strong. So look forward to seeing him. And then Paul Delahay's two daughters and son kind of spearhead the association. Now they changed the name to the Duty to Remember Association because they wanted to remember just not the Americans, but the Canadians and the British and, all the different nations that came over and helped liberate their country. And they're wonderful events. They last several days where they have, like I mentioned, band concerts and dances and dinners. And at those, the local beer, the Chimay, just flows and everyone has a grand time. And then the more, serious or solemn occasions, they have these ceremonies at the various memorials. One will be at my dad's memorial, one will be at the memorial at Cendron, which is right at the French-Belgian border, where the U.S. 9th Infantry crossed over the Wartraus River from France into Belgium on September 2nd to liberate the country, to liberate the first village in the country. And then there's another memorial to some of my dad's crew who were killed and some of the other airmen from other B-17s that were killed at another location, which was a real tragedy. And this year, my entire family's going. There's 15 of us. My kids, my sister, her kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, and relatives of 5 other members of the Susan Ruth crew are coming over. And it's nice that a lot of them on this anniversary are going to be grandchildren of some of the crew that have never been there. And they'll see all that. And so they have no idea what they're in store for until you go to these. They're so moving and so emotional and so much fun. So that'll be terrific. And other people who are interested in Belgium and the Netherlands. It's interesting that they have a number of American cemeteries in Europe. And they have a couple in Belgium and one in the Netherlands. And some of the airmen that were killed over there are still buried in those cemeteries. And they have every grave at those cemeteries are adopted by local people to honor and remember the man who lies in that grave. And on then certain occasions and holidays and what have you, they come and bring flowers and they place them on the grave. So they call them adopters, grave adopters. And some of them are coming down from Belgium and the Netherlands to honor those men who were killed, who they never met and didn't know, but just know their story. So it's just a grand thing. And then we have all of my dad's helpers, all the Belgian people who were in the underground at the time, they're all gone. But some of their relatives, and ancestors are still with us, and they come, relatives of people that hid my dad or other members of his crew. And, we become a family. It's just a wonderful, wonderful thing.
Wow. That's truly incredible. And it's so moving to hear how all of the people who your dad interacted with when he was shot down, I mean, how much they sacrificed to help and how grateful they are for him helping them. And, that spirit of cooperation and sacrifice. I mean, just the ultimate sacrifice in a lot of ways. I mean, that's really inspirational. Now, when I have two questions that I really want to learn more about. When your dad came back and you got to interact with him, how much of this did you get to talk about with him? And I know you talked about how before that memorial, before he was around his all of his buddies, maybe he was a bit more reserved, but then, how much did y'all really talk about it? What was that like?
Not a lot when I was young. I mean, because I was born and grew up, right after the war. At that time, there were all these war movies that, were out in the 50s about it. I loved watching those World War II movies, and uh, my parents made me read, and so I read books about World War II, so I was always really interested. And me and my buddies, when we were little, we used to play Army all the time, with these fake guns. And we go to the Army surplus stores and buy helmets and canteens and backpacks. And then my dad brought his uniforms home, and I would put on his some of those, and we'd go in vacant lots. Back there were lots of vacant lots, and there was lots of buildings, so you could, go in these wooden frame apartment buildings, and pretend, there were so many places to play back when I was a kid. So we played it a lot, but my dad and I didn't really talk about it at all. I just knew the basics. I knew that he was a B-17 pilot. He was stationed in England. His plane was named after my sister. He flew bombing missions. He was shot down. He was missing in action for 7 months, and then, came back. But I didn't know any details. And my dad did see, of the crew members that survived, he did see them occasionally. But when they would come over to the house, again, I was so young, I had, no interest in it. My parents would make me come out of my bedroom playing with my toys and say, say hello and shake hands with, Mr. and Mrs. Musial or whatever. And like, okay, like an idiot, when you're young, you just don't realize these things. You're into what you're doing. And even when you get older, you're going to college, you get married, you have a job, you're starting to raise a family. And I hear this from so many people. I'm so fortunate that I am blessed that I know so much about my dad and his World War II history. Most people I run into and talk to know very little about their veteran because they didn't talk about it. I always like to hear from people who read the book that, at least they'll say, well, my dad didn't talk about it. By reading your book, I gained an appreciation and knowledge, for what they did go through. And so it really wasn't until my dad started going back to Belgium that he started talking about it. Until I got to, in was it 94, it wasn't until I was in my 40s till, I really started appreciating it. That first trip to Belgium in 94, was a real eye opener for me. And then, when my wife and I went back in 2004, so it wasn't until later in life. And then in 2004, I went up for a ride in a B-17 just to get a little taste of what it felt like to be in a B-17, which is an absolutely thrilling thing to do. I've been up again since then just to get a little taste. It just gives you chills, going up in those old, you don't realize, if you've never been in a B-17, you have no idea how cramped it is. It's more crowded than a submarine in a B-17. And so just gradually, as I got more settled, in life, my appreciation just grew and grew and grew. But, growing up, not much. My dad and I were close. He was a great dad. My sisters and I always compared him to John Wayne. He was that type of, he was, a tall guy, he was 6'3", rugged guy, no nonsense guy. Either John Wayne or, you have to be old enough to remember the TV show Gunsmoke, but James Arness, Marshall Dillon, we compared him to those two guys. But he was even though he was, tough, he was, disciplinarian. He loves, he was a loving father. He coached my little league baseball teams, came to all my sporting events, and supported me when I was in high school. And so we had a real good relationship. And my dad wasn't the last crew member to die, but he was the oldest at 91. He died in 2007. The last Susan Ruth crew member died in 2010. So he had a long, rich life. And no regrets from that standpoint.
Wow. So, Steve, I want to thank you so much for coming on to the show and for sharing, all of this. I think it's so important, and I'm very grateful that you would, you know, take the time to share this kind of stuff because of how important it really is. So I wanted to say thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure. I appreciate it. Any chance I get to tell the story, and the book's not just about my dad. It's about what happened to each member of the crew and about all those courageous Belgian people that risked their lives to help them. And really, in an overall sense, it's to all the men of the 8th Air Force and all of the men who fought during World War II. There were 16 million veterans at the end of the war. And that number has been rapidly declining ever since the end. And there's only about 3% of those men still with us. There's different figures. It's about 350 to 400 of those veterans are passing away every day, and soon we won't have them. And unless their stories are told, they'll be lost forever. So, like I say, it's what I do, and I have a passion for it. And it's been 5 years now that I've been doing this. How long I'll continue doing this, I don't know, but I love meeting lots of people, and I'm fortunate to meet a lot of veterans as well. So thanks again for having me on the show, Ben. One of my youngest grandkids is named Ben.
Wow. The honor's truly mine. So thank you very much. And to everybody who's watching and listening, I want to thank y'all very much. Y'all's time is very valuable too. So I'm very grateful that y'all would choose to stay with us until the end and, to really be a part of this story too, because it's important for all of us, no matter what corner of the globe you're in. It has affected you in some way. And, I think history is tremendously important to know. So thanks for being a part of it. And I will see y'all on the next episode. Take care now.